Now, while the world was grappling with COVID-19, we at Times Network started on the journey to talk about how India could revive herself. And over the last few months, you would have seen on the India Revival Mission across the network a slew of voices from different sectors, from different fields, talking about the India Revival Mission. As we move towards the culmination of this journey, we have put together a white paper that talks about the path forward, and we will be discussing that in detail on this special show. But before we do that, it's also important to take stock of where we stand today. Now, in the last quarter, the GDP growth has come in the positive territory at 0.4%. So we're still just about flat, but at least we've moved out of a technical recession in just 2 quarters. On a host of parameters, the improvement can be seen, but many are still grappling with whether this is a V-shaped recovery or a K-shaped recovery. Are all sectors and all segments of society seeing the recovery they need to? And clearly there is a lot more to be done. So speaking on this today, I'm joined by Abhik Barua. He's the Chief Economist at HDFC Bank. Madan Sabnavis is with us on the show show today. He's Chief Economist of Care Ratings. And we welcome Amit Kapoor, Chairman, Institute for Competitiveness. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for speaking with us. Amit, let me begin by asking you to set the stage, really set the tone for our conversation. Now, you have partnered with the Times Network in bringing this white paper together, which, as we showed, was presented to the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman as well, and it talks about 4 clear areas. Could you briefly take us through those 4 key points?
When we really talk about the India Revival Mission and the white paper, there were 2 or 3 very big things that we were really looking at. One was, of course, as we were really on to this process, India had hit a wall or a slowdown. But the question was that how India is actually going to revive back. And what is it that India can actually do? One was, of course, when you talk about recovery, the question was that can we actually have investment in, say, low stage manufacturing, or what you would call as where low skill manufacturing. Can we actually do that? That was one of the most important factors that had to be looked at. In fact, from an India's competitiveness viewpoint, of course, the productivity had gone down, the slowdown was there, but there was this huge opportunity to really look at manufacturing once again, and manufacturing from a very interesting perspective. And that was to really identify the sectors where we can actually get into. And that is what did come out very, very strongly. In fact, we talked to close to about 600 CEOs, and all the 600 CEOs, and most of them said that yes, India needs to actually focus on manufacturing, and especially low-skill manufacturing. And this is where another point did come through, was that most of the states who are trying to do all the things under the sun, if you're really talking about sectors, they want to do everything from on a 2-digit code, they would like to do all 14, 15 things. But this is where it was that we should identify the big sectors that are there for each of the states, identify their competitive advantages, and really move ahead. So that was one very, very important factor that did come across from the white paper. The second thing was that how do we really look at what we would call as, say, capital formation? How can we attract investments in a very, very big way? So that was another point that did come through. Of course, there are many steps that the government had actually taken, but there are more things that can actually be done.
Abhik, I want to talk specifically about increasing low-skilled manufacturing, and in the backdrop of what states have been doing. That's an important point that was raised earlier in the discussion, because I think towards the end of last year, we saw a fight, a competition of sorts break out between states to announce more and more lucrative sounding measures for companies setting up. And then in 2021, you come and you have a situation where the state of Haryana says that we will reserve 75% of jobs, even in the private sector, for locals. Now, as we head into 5 state elections, there are other states that are saying that as well. How do you reconcile these 2 things together?
Well, I think this is sort of the classic conflict between what is seen as good politics and good economics. And I think states should make their minds up as to what they should be focusing on. And ultimately, I think, good economics makes for good politics, although it might seem a little, it's tempting to go in for, populist measures like, reserving jobs for local ethnic groups. it has a short-term payoff. But ultimately, I think the long-term game has to be economic growth and development, and the distribution of the benefits of economic growth and development. So it's about time that states kind of avoided these short-term political compulsions and focused squarely on growth, because they will pay a huge price in the long term if they kind of gave economics the short shrift, and went in for these short-term political tricks. I'm sure the short-term tricks might just sort of pay off in the upcoming elections. But what about 5 years later, when your GDP per capita GDP turns out to be much lower than a neighboring state, because the neighboring state has decided to go and force sound economic policy. So I think states just have to make up their minds and stick to it. I think one of the biggest problems that a lot of companies face is this entire business of policy uncertainty. And what you cited was a classic case of policy uncertainty. Suddenly a state decides we are going to reserve jobs for locals. It just completely, upends all sort of calculations, all the sort of balances that companies have worked out in order to do their business in the long term. You just can't afford to do this anymore, especially since we have an enormous challenge going forward in getting back on a reasonable growth path, and making up for the losses that would have accrued because of the pandemic, and it's likely to continue after the pandemic. And as you very clearly pointed out, despite the some of the encouraging numbers, we're not out of the woods yet. So let's get real about economics.
That's, a very good point. And we've seen how it's playing out. Now you have, especially in a place like Gurugram, which has exploded, you've had a pushback and the government says they'll come to the table, etc. Madan, I would like to get your view on another aspect which has been listed out in these key 4 points, and that is improving demand. It says for durables, but generally improving consumption. Now, here's the tricky part, because you suddenly have some indicators or some anecdotal evidence that consumption has spiked in certain areas. So four-wheeler or passenger vehicles are doing well. Suddenly real estate is hot again after lying dormant for years. But on the other hand, you have a Nielsen report which says there is a whole new set of people in urban India who are holding back on purchases and consumption. How do you look at the consumption issue right now?
In fact, I think this has been the major problem which we have had, low consumption. And I think I would relate it directly to job creation. And if you look at the last maybe 5-7 years, the government response is normally on the supply side. So we keep talking a lot, we keep harping a lot about having enabling policies, which definitely are important. So I can be having a PLI scheme, which on paper sounds very good. But finally, the question is that if I'm producing goods, whom do I produce these goods for? It is finally for the consumer. And I think this is the problem which we have had even before the pandemic set in, that consumption has not been increasing at commensurate rates with what we're seeing about what we're seeing in the GDP numbers. And I think that's been really holding back. And that the main reason is that because we have not created enough jobs. So it's one thing to keep having these arguments of saying, I use the CMI data, I use the EPFO data to show that jobs have been created. But at the end of the day, I think if jobs are being created, people spending money. And today it's been compounded by the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty, because if I look at the corporate sector, for example, we've not been having increments, we've not been having any changes in salaries. In fact, lots of companies have cut back on salaries, some have been restored, but most of them remain still in a state of flux. So in this case of uncertainty, I think it's difficult for one to really say it can go out and consume. So I think we get carried away. Probably during the Diwali time, we said, look, there's a pent-up demand which has come through. But again, you look at the IIP data which came out for January, I think the consumer goods took a backseat once again, negative growth coming through. So this kind of volatility in the numbers of consumption just show that consumption is not stabilized. So I think we need to create jobs, and let's remember one thing, irrespective of what you're talking of a V-shaped recovery, I think that is just getting into various kinds of terminology to try and talk about great things happening. But at the end of the day, jobs are not created in 1 year's time, they'll be created over a period of 3 to 4 years, because we've actually lost this job creation ability. And today with this pandemic, work from home, we are relying more on technology. Lots of companies are saying, let's bring in AI and ML to replace human. So I don't think it's a good sign, but that's the true state of consumption today.
And Amit, here I'd like you to come in on what you have suggested in this white paper on boosting consumption. Some interesting, pointers there, including a voucher system that you talk about, exclusive to ration stores, to be launched for essential. You say that's better than cash transfers. I want your view on what has been done so far to propel consumption. India, for one, has really not gone and put money in people's hands, apart from very specific schemes right in the beginning of the lockdown. Do you think there is a case to change that?
I don't think so. We cannot really say that we have to put money into the hands of the people in terms of by giving a lot more, say something like Manrega or whatever. What we really need to look at is that how do we enable the environment to really create jobs, as Madan was saying. That becomes a very important factor because we have to meaningfully employ people and gainfully employ them. The question here is going to be what government has done. I clearly see it as a long-term step and a long-term endeavor, which is going to give benefits over a longer period of time. But in the short term, I think they've also taken steps which are important in terms of saying, okay, that how they have not really touched the taxation rates given the pandemic that was happening. But having said that, there is a very important factor that we are seeing in terms of the pent-up demand, as you were saying. I think there are larger sets of consumption patterns that are being seen. I see that there is a huge recovery. In fact, we were talking about two distinct sectors. One of them is like clearly automotive, which has seen this huge demand that is actually accrued. The second thing is, say, if you really talk about jewelry is something like in the jewelry business, what we have seen is that they are back to about 10 or 90% of the sales that actually happened year on year in the previous year. So that means there is a huge demand that is actually out there. Of course, we have lost jobs, but that was actually because of the what I call a wall that we have actually hit. The question is going to be that how do we really take that step forward? Having said that, I think we are onto the right trajectory. The only question is going to be that how long would it actually take? I am more optimistic in terms of saying that we are going to be on a track wherein we are in a position to get back to where we were in the next 12 months and see a much more positive growth, because we have to look at long-term impact rather than short-term situations or very short-term gains per se.
We are now at a stage where we're seeing possibly another spike in numbers. People are calling it a third wave, a second wave, a new wave. Do you think that this could derail the recovery process? Are there fears of that? Or are we now armed and equipped enough to deal with what will come next?
Well, I think we are certainly better equipped to deal with both the health impact as well as the economic fallout of another wave. But we can't get away from the fact, especially if you see the experience of other economies in Europe, in other parts of the world, which have seen severe second or third waves, that this would have some, damaging impact on the economy. Well, what we've seen, and this is again sort of getting back to the V-shaped recovery, that for some indicators, you've seen a pretty sort of unidirectional northward movement. And you will start seeing wobbles there. Hopefully it will not turn down, but we could also sort of expect some of the indicators to start turning down, and then we'll have to choose another alphabet. So yes, so we're better equipped, but there will be consequences.
Madan, one sector I think we must speak about in the context of what has happened in this 1 year is how we have suddenly been recognized the world over as the pharmacy of the world. A Serum Institute of India was the largest vaccine producer even before COVID-19 came around, but we really accelerated in that sense. Today, India is sitting with sufficient vaccines and not having to scrounge around. In fact, we've exported and sent vaccines to 70 countries around the world. How do we leverage this, our space now in the pharmaceutical industry globally moving ahead?
In fact, I think it does a lot of credit to the country. I think what the pharmaceutical industry has done today in terms of being the leading, in terms of making India one of the leading manufacturers of vaccines. And we should also remember that if you look at the drugs and pharma industry, almost 50% of its output was anyway being exported. So India was always a leader when it came to pharmaceuticals. And I think this point is only being reiterated or buttressed under these conditions, where I think you look at any write-up on the vaccination, and India's name always comes up. I think Mr. Poonawala has made a very good name for himself as well as for the country, where people are talking in terms of the vaccination. And also, given our experience in terms of vaccinating population, I think the success in India is likely to be very, very good. That's where I'm very, very hopeful about, because we've done it for a variety of diseases, something which other countries are not really used to. So this whole case of mass vaccination of the entire population is something which India will be able to achieve faster than other countries.
Have we learned enough 1 year later? Will this just be another blip? And will it really upset the trajectory of revival? My sense is not really. We're seeing a spike in cases and we're dealing with it impactfully right at the start of it. So hopefully we can be a little optimistic there. Overall, safe to say that through these months of the India Revival Mission, we have seen resilience coming in from various sectors, from the Indian people really, and that hopefully will carry us through. I want to thank all of you for joining us on the show. We'll take a very short break.